Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Jon Hopkins, Ritual. I feel like it's become more difficult to know how much to expect out of a new Jon Hopkins record these days. This guy has long been one of electronic music's biggest critical darlings, and it used to be a big event whenever he released something. The trilogy of albums he put out back-to-back, from Insides in 2009 to Immunity in 2013 to Singularity in 2018, were all such a big deal that got the whole electronic music world turning their heads. I think all three of those could be argued as modern classics depending on who you ask. The guy just has a one-of-a-kind, high-detail, but really emotionally uplifting sound that nobody can really compare to. Also, having re-listened to all three of those albums for this video, they're a lot closer in quality for me than they used to be. Singularity was pretty underwhelming in comparison to the previous two when it first came out, especially immediately after I posted my review. But I think it started to grow on me again back into great territory in retrospect. There's still an experience I can get out of that record that I can't get anywhere else. Immunity was always my favorite, and while it's still incredible, it did hit kinda different in 2024 now that house and garage are like the primary zeitgeist for electronic music, so it doesn't stand out from the crowd quite as much as it did back in the day. And Insides may or may not have been growing on me enough to possibly be my new favorite of all of his albums, for being easily his most abstract and experimental and daring work, though, again, the level of enjoyment I get out of all three of those is very close now. They're all roughly on par with each other. I didn't re-listen to Contact Note, but I vaguely recall that one possibly being in the same conversation as well. Anyway, as much excitement as new Jon Hopkins albums used to instill in me and the entire electronic community as a whole, I feel like that kinda stopped being as much of a thing when he put out his next album in 2021, Music for Psychedelic Therapy. That project marked a move for him into straight-up, regular old traditional ambient music. And while it was very nice for what it was and lived up to the purpose it set out to achieve, it felt weird that this was a mainline album for him. That this was treated as his proper follow-up to those last three albums instead of just a one-off side project, which it felt a lot more like. I'd wanted to cover it in a proper video at the time, but I just had so little to say about it that I ended up stuffing it in a Some Stuff I Missed segment instead. It was extremely nice and pleasant ambient music, with almost nothing of substance to break down or analyze in such a video, and I felt like any sufficiently talented ambient artist could have made it. I wouldn't have been able to easily tell it was Jon Hopkins if you hadn't told me. And thus, when with the announcement of this latest album, Ritual, he made clear that Music for Psychedelic Therapy was not a one-off, and that this was going to be a companion piece to add on to that album in particular, albeit with a teaser that did seem to promise that the results would at least be adhering more to his own unique sound again, and with an even more stacked list of collaborators behind the scenes, including Ishq and Clark, vocalist Violana, and some of the same co-producers that were there on the last one, like Seven Rays and Sheriff Hashizume. I was looking forward to it, but I wasn't going into it with quite as high expectations as I wanted to have. I figured I was just going to get a generally good time, but nothing transcendent, as has been the case with most of the big electronic album releases that have happened in 2024 so far. And there was maybe something a little deflating about that, I suppose. At the very least, I can confirm that even if Ritual is in fact not as much of a big event as the guy's best work, it is a step back in the right direction for him, and I feel like hearing this did allow me to better compartmentalize what his last two albums were doing, since it's basically just a mix between those last two albums. This is still an album whose primary purpose is to be an ambient record, and doesn't have the level of detail or expansiveness going into it that his best work does, but it does still have plenty of texture and progression to it, following a more epic-sounding, loose narrative arc. And it feels much more like the kind of thing that you could only get from Jon Hopkins. Hearing it also actually made me glad that Music for Psychedelic Therapy was a main album instead of a side project, since if this had been the guy's follow-up to Singularity after a 6-year wait, this probably would have been pretty disappointing. Like he was just doing an even less distinct and more watered-down version of that album again. But having Music for Psychedelic Therapy treated as a main album, and this album being advertised directly as a companion piece to it, made this album much easier to take at face value and digest it on the level it was actually designed to be digested. So, let's go into what actually goes into this album. It's separated into 8 distinct parts, but is clearly meant to be digested all as a single piece. Things do admittedly start out pretty slow. Part 1, Altar, is basically just a monolithic drone piece with very little going on. It sounds quite dramatic. There's a lot of nice bass, extremely light bell and vocal textures in the background. Nice as an intro, but is probably the least interesting or evocative part of the album for me. As we move into the next 2 parts, though, things do start to kick into gear more. Part 2, Palace/Illusion, and Part 3, Transcend/Lament. Despite having 4 different titles between them, may as well all just be the exact same 11-minute track. But this is the part at which all these more rhythmic synth arpeggios get introduced. In the beginning of part 2, I suppose the Palace section, it remains pretty light and pleasant. And then I guess the Illusion section gets a little more well-layered and cinematic sounding as the piece picks up more momentum. And part 3 acts as the climax which the entire previous part had been building up to. I don't meaningfully notice any kind of difference between any Transcend or Lament sections, but the vibe created by all of it does live up to both of those titles. As we move into part 4, The Veil, the piece starts to get a little darker and more percussive as the synth arpeggios all center themselves on a single note, and there's all these big and cavernous thumps of percussion at periodic intervals. And then we start to move into the album's second half, which in my opinion is all around much stronger than the album's first half. Part 5, Evocation, takes the exact same darker mix as Part 4 and builds on it even further to make it feel even bigger and more epic, introducing this buzzing bass pattern running through the full mix and adding in even more thumping and clattering percussion patterns. And much like how Part 3 acted as the climactic payoff to Part 2's build-up, Part 6, Solar Goddess Return, serves the same purpose in relation to Part 5. In fact, that part also kind of feels like the climax of the entire album, where everything comes together at once. The buzzing bass, the percussion, the darker atmospherics, and a heck of a lot of expansive ambience made out of Vailana's wordless vocals, just enveloping everything and taking the album into its biggest dramatic height by the end. And the rest of the album acts as our falling action and final resolution. We get Part 7, Dissolution, where as per the title, everything has dissolved into formless ambient pads with absolutely no other accompaniment. Though as simple and stripped back as the mix has gotten at this point, this cut in particular ended up as one of the biggest emotional high points for me. Those simple, shifting chord progressions just really tug at the heartstrings in a way that no other moment on the album does, and there is something really magical about it. And speaking of tugging at the heartstrings, what's a Jon Hopkins album without some nice emotional pianos? And thus we finish with Part 8, Nothing Is Lost, which is of course primarily just a solo piano piece. Predictably very nice and tender, and makes for the perfect way for the album to close out, just in the same way as many a Jon Hopkins project has in the past. There is almost 2 full minutes of an empty drone fading out into near silence at the very end. Maybe I wouldn't have let that stretch on so long. Like, the core of the track is really just like 4 minutes when it looks like it's approaching 6. But still, nitpicks. Still a really strong, if predictable, finish. Yeah, Ritual is not an album that gives me much to complain about. This is the kind of experience that I come to Jon Hopkins for. Would I put it among his best work? No, I do still pine for the days when his albums felt like so much more of a big deal and had so much more going into them. This album seems to cement Hopkins' desire to musically settle down and not be quite as ambitious and far-reaching as he once was. But even if I might be wishing for more out of it, the core of what's always made his albums work so well in the past is still here. It still hits all the right emotional notes and feels as big and evocative as he was trying to make it. It's not going to be a year-end list contender or anything, but it is another quality addition to his catalog that's as worth hearing as anything else he's done, and I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.